This is a conversation with Hal Brands, a professor at Johns Hopkins University and one of the most respected and influential thinkers on US foreign policy and the global power dynamics of today. In this conversation, we talk about the return of geopolitics, about why our ideas about geopolitics that dominated the world 100 years ago and that were at the beginning of all the great wars of the 20th century now making a comeback, about why they now threaten to start other great wars in our time and define the 21st century as well, and whether and how it can be prevented or if it's already too late. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And this podcast is also supported by generous supporters on Patreon that you can join to get access to full-length ad-free interviews and a bunch of other perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about the book you just wrote and it's being published now called The Eurasian Century, where, to sort of summarize it, the main focus is on what's called Eurasia and why a fight over who will control this landmass shaped both the 20th century and, in your view, it's likely to shape the 21st century as well. And this idea that you're talking about in the book has been here for a while, but I think today it has been somewhat forgotten. So maybe to start and to be able to dive deeper into it, can we first explain the concept that you're following up on and your argument a little bit as well of what is actually Eurasia and why did people 100 years ago think it was so important, and why, in your view, the conquest over or the competition over who controls it will shape our time as well?
Sure. So for starters, Eurasia is kind of what it sounds like. It's basically the combined expanse of Europe and Asia. And so it encompasses that big landmass that runs essentially from the Atlantic coast of Europe all the way to Asia's Pacific margins, but then also is typically thought to encompass the nearby offshore islands that are part of those continents. And so the United Kingdom off the coast of Europe, for instance, and then island chains like Japan and the Philippines off the coast of Asia. And the reason that landmass has long been important is that it is where most of the world's people live. It is where most of the world's economic resources are found. And it is, therefore, where most of the world's military potential resides. What made Eurasia such an interesting concept to people who were writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, people like Halford Mackinder, for instance, was that the march of technology was integrating that supercontinent in a new way. And so Mackinder gave his famous lecture on the importance of Eurasia in early 1904, just as the Trans-Siberian Railway was being completed. And the proliferation of railways in general, and that railway in particular across Eurasia, raised the prospect that a big aggressive power could move big armies over larger distances than really at any time since Genghis Khan. And so it opened up new horizons of conquest within Eurasia. And the fear of Mackinder, also people like Alfred Thayer Mahan and later Nicholas Speakman, was that if a country or group of countries managed to conquer all or most of Eurasia, they would wield more power than any other countervailing alliance in the world. And they could use Eurasia as a platform to build navies and otherwise find ways of intimidating and coercing and perhaps, in the worst case, conquering countries located even across the oceans. And so the insight that these folks had was that the course of 20th century geopolitics was likely to be shaped by big fights over Eurasia between aggressive powers that would try to sort of play out this script, and then their enemies, including the offshore powers like Britain or the United States, that would try to resist. And, you can argue about who got the details wrong and right, but at a very high level, I would argue that this explains the great conflicts of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And it's also a fair mental map for understanding what's happening as the United States and its friends confront countries like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran today.
So you've mentioned that there were some fundamental changes that made this idea relevant in the early 20th century, like transcontinental railways, and basically that the world was getting smaller. So why is it, at least in my sense, becoming more important or relevant specifically today?
In some ways, what we're seeing today is just a continuation of the conflicts that occurred during the 20th century. And so you can look at what Russia, China, Iran, and their ilk are doing individually. And so they are each individually trying to upset the balance of power in key regions, whether that's Eastern Europe or the Middle East or East Asia. But if you put it all together, what they are trying to do is shift the balance of power in all of the key regions that make up Eurasia, and to undermine the rules and the norms that have structured the international order that the U.S. and its friends put in place to contain Eurasian anarchy after 1945. So in that sense, it's a continuation of the struggles that we saw during the 20th century. What becomes clear, though, when you look at these things collectively, is that technology is always evolving. And the evolution of technology interacts with this ongoing struggle for Eurasia in interesting ways. And so during World War II, for instance, the advent of carrier-based air power and highly mobile armored units provided a greater mobility of power, certainly than we had seen in World War I or in earlier eras, and basically turbocharged these programs of Eurasian conquest. In the Cold War, one of the key questions is how nuclear weapons can either be used as tools of geopolitical coercion and aggression by the Soviet Union and its allies, or as means of stabilizing, sustaining a favorable global status quo by the United States. As we get into the 21st century, this whole sort of old story is playing out in different ways. And so on the one hand, you have sort of the continuing evolution of military technology that is playing out in the struggle to shape the balance of power within the first island chain in the Western Pacific, for instance, where the Chinese are developing ways of trying to keep the United States out of the region so they can project power against their neighbors, and the U.S. is trying to find ways of counteracting that. But it's also happening in the context of what's often been called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and so that this broader shift toward new high-tech sectors where the countries that are dominant in those sectors may be dominant in the contest for power in the 21st century. And so technology is never static. And what we've seen over the past 120 years is that its evolutions sort of change the particulars of the struggle for Eurasia, even as the underlying pattern remains.
So basically, the fundamentals of geography haven't really changed since then, but at the same time, some of those processes that were really important in the early 20th century are basically cyclically once again kind of coming to play.
The way I like to think of it is that geography creates habits, it creates patterns, and it's hard to break out of those patterns. And so it is still true today, as it was in 1913, that it would threaten America's geopolitical interests if a hostile country was able to take control over East Asia or Western Europe and then turn that into a platform for projecting coercion into the wider world. But the ways in which those struggles play out differ over time, and the ways in which advantage is accrued differ over time as a result of technological change. And in some cases, there is a debate about how this happens. And so if you had asked people 10 to 15 years ago, most of them would have said that the nature of economic power has changed fundamentally in the 21st century. It's no longer primarily a matter of dominating mass manufacturing as it was for much of the the 19th and 20th centuries. It's about occupying key nodes in value chains and dominating high-tech industries, leading in services, and so on and so forth. And I think that's true to a certain extent. But as we find ourselves back in an era where big wars, great power wars seem more likely, we're also being reminded that the ability to make stuff is still really, really important, right? And so the particular role that technology and economic evolutions play at any given time is important. It's also contested.
And I guess another, what seems like quite a fundamental shift is that while in the 20th century, if we're talking about Eurasia, the primary focus and importance was on the European part of it, where the core of the wars, world wars or the Cold War, really took place. Whereas now it seems that the momentum or the importance has shifted more towards Asia, and Europe, especially now, I would say from the US perspective, seems kind of forgotten.
I think that's right. I think that Europe, certainly in World War I and World War II, and to an extent in the Cold War, was where the biggest geopolitical challenges emerged. Right, that World War I was essentially a European war with global implications. World War II was a global war, but U.S. officials always believed, rightly in my view, that Nazi Germany was the greater threat to the global equilibrium over time. The Soviet Union is kind of a weird case because it's a Eurasian power and more of it is in Asia than it is in Europe. But sort of the geopolitical core of the Soviet Union was European, or at least it was Europe focused for most of the Cold War. And now we find ourselves in a situation where I think basically everybody in the U.S. at least agrees that the biggest sort of threat to global order is coming from the Asia Pacific rather than Europe. That whereas Russia is the country that's most violently challenging that system, China has the greatest capacity to disrupt it in fundamental ways because it's just a more powerful actor with a stronger economic base. The challenge, and this is also an issue that sort of echoes throughout the history of this period, is that just because the United States or America and its allies decide that the primary threat is in Theater A, that doesn't mean that problems in Theater B or Theater C go away. And so a big part of the challenge that U.S. officials have faced really since the late 1930s is figuring out how to execute a global foreign policy, even as one region may seem more important than the others. And so just to take this back to the run-up to World War II, Franklin Roosevelt firmly believed that Nazi Germany was a bigger problem than Imperial Japan, and yet he was willing to run a very high risk of war with Imperial Japan, and ultimately to get into a war with Japan before he got into a war with Germany, because he understood that Japan was also challenging the balance of power in a very important region in a fundamental way. And so now the challenge that the U.S. confronts is that, yeah, China's the biggest threat, but Russia is violently contesting the security architecture of a very important region right now. And so the U.S. isn't going to be able, or it shouldn't at least, just walk away from that region and say we're going to focus 100% of our effort on China. And figuring out how to balance those things is going to be the test of the coming years.
I wanted to focus on that a little bit later in the conversation, but since we're bringing it up, I'm happy to jump into it. Basically, it seems that it's one of the points in the U.S. foreign policy debate where there is really not an agreement, and that's to what extent it is really about focusing on both theaters at once. And there, especially right now with the incoming administration, a lot of the people who are there seem to have the idea that you need to, in order for you to have the resources to counter China in Asia, you need to really leave Europe to Europeans, and that Russia is not so much of a threat or an American problem as a European one. And so America should disentangle from it as fast as it can and really focus fully on Asia. What's your view on that?
I think it's intellectually attractive, but I think it suffers from some serious liabilities. The first of those liabilities is that it is all well and good and correct to suggest that the U.S. needs to get more military spending and more defense effort and more collective effort out of its European allies. I wouldn't argue against that for a moment. But the reality is that even if in some magical world the European part of NATO was to double military spending today, that wouldn't solve the problem of how you sustain Ukraine for the next 3 or 4 years, because European defense industrial bases just aren't in a position to do that. It wouldn't solve the problem of how you deal with a hyper-militarized, sort of hyper-revisionist Russia that doesn't appear to be particularly patient in the way that it is pressing against the Western security order, and that's carrying out some very violent and very risky sabotage and subversion efforts within the West. And so there's this one problem of like, how do you get from where you are today to where you need to be? And if the U.S. just says we're done with Europe right now, there's this big gap that opens up that no good actor can fill for the time being. The second place I think that argument stumbles is it forgets what the transatlantic relationship is and what it's about in the first place. What the U.S. and most Europeans concluded after World War II was that having a dominant U.S. security role in Europe was the only way of A, deterring aggression by the Soviet Union, but equally important, B, tamping down the tensions that had ripped Europe apart twice in the quarter century before 1939. And so the U.S. is sort of uniquely trusted to play a leading role in Europe's security affairs precisely because it is not European, right? Because it is not part of this old system of European rivalries. It's not interested in where the border is drawn between country A and country B and so on and so forth. And so if the U.S. were to take sort of the extreme version of an Asia first foreign policy and say, we're out of NATO, or we're just simply not providing the military leadership that we provided before, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that you could see an erosion of these arrangements and you would see eventually a return to a more rivalrous Europe. Now, I think that it is, again, true that the U.S. is going to need more out of its European allies, just as the U.S. is going to have to put forward more effort to deal with the fact that there are challenges in 3 theaters simultaneously. But I hope that won't come in the form of basically saying, over to you guys, we're out of here.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed.
I want to definitely talk more about the U.S. foreign policy on that and other issues. But before that, I wanted to get back a little bit to talking more about the threat that you're sort of talking about in the book. And a big part of what you focus on is not so much or apart from just the individual actors like China, Russia, Iran, you focus a lot on the growing common cause and cooperation between them, that they're all bound by similar goals. And I think it's really interesting because it's often quite swept aside in some debates with the counter argument that basically they're not an alliance and that the interests of these actors are too different, even opposing in some cases, and that it's not really an alliance but sort of this temporary marriage of convenience and a relationship that's fundamentally different from an alliance like NATO or the alliances that the US has, because it's based purely on interests rather than shared values. And that even though that Russia and China, for example, talk about that they have no limits, in practice, it's their relationship is very, very limited. So what's your view on that? And I think both on the, if you could sort of describe how you see this growing network, but also what's your view on this counter argument against it?
I think people are prisoners of their experiences, and Americans, and to a certain extent Europeans, are prisoners of the experience since 1949 when the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. And Americans have a bad habit of looking at their alliances, namely NATO, and assuming that that is how all alliances work. When in fact, NATO is much more the exception than the norm. Most alliances in history were never considered to be permanent. They were thought to be temporary and tactical. Most marriages are marriages of convenience, right? That's true in geopolitics, and it's true, true throughout history and sort of people's personal lives as well. And you can have relationships that do not bring people or countries together forever in a genuine love match that can still have serious strategic effects. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen in the relationships among the autocratic powers today. So it is true that Russia and China have a bunch of lingering historical frictions. Every now and again, the Chinese government will print a map that shows a big chunk of Russia belonging to China. It's true that the Chinese are super uncomfortable with what the Russians are doing with North Korea right now because they worry it will lead to more North Korean bad behavior that will blow back on China. But the relationships that these countries have developed are nonetheless shifting the strategic equilibrium and having serious strategic effects. And one example of this would be Ukraine, where I think it is quite clear that Putin would have lost the war in Ukraine by now if it was not for the economic aid, the economic support and trade he has gotten from China, which has basically sustained his war economy over the past 3 years, and the military kit and now the troops that he has gotten from Iran and especially North Korea. And so you have this very concrete instance where a challenge to the international order is being intensified. It's being sustained by these relationships. But it works in other ways as well. And so Russian military dealings, military trade, military co-production development with China has already accelerated China's military buildup in some important ways. And the fear now is that as Russia becomes more dependent on these relationships, it will increasingly trade away its technological crown jewels, submarine quieting technology, space launch technology, other forms of know-how, to China, to North Korea in particular, in ways that will accelerate the emergence of disruptive military challenges in other regions. And so you don't have to believe that this autocratic entente will hold together in perpetuity to see that it is already having pronounced strategic implications.
I think maybe to follow up on that and to play the devil's advocate a little bit to make it interesting, you could say that what China is doing with Russia when it comes to Ukraine is still basically limiting it only to things that are purely in China's interest. So, for example, it's not doing anything which would help Russia, but which could risk imposing sanctions on China. So it's not selling arms to Russia, and it is allowing Russia to survive economically by buying its resources, but that's also benefiting China because it's able to buy them at a very discounted price. So it does seem that it is still quite limited.
Yeah, I mean, so look, there are always degrees of support that one country can provide another. And so, you can imagine a world where China would say, we're going to send, 3 infantry divisions to fight along Russia on the front lines in Donetsk. Obviously China has not done that, and China is very likely not going to do that. But that doesn't mean that the support that China has provided is unimportant to Russia. And so I think the best estimates that we hear in Washington is that Chinese microchips, Chinese machine tools, things like that have played a really important role in sustaining and rebuilding the Russian defense industrial base of the past 3 years, even as it has been heavily sanctioned by the West. And the other point to keep in mind is that just because a relationship is transactional doesn't mean that it doesn't matter or that it doesn't have strategic effects. I can do something for you that is in my interests, and it still accentuates your ability to accomplish something. And I think that's a good way of looking at the Russia-China relationship. The Chinese are not sort of giving away their support to Russia. They're driving quite a hard bargain in terms of their economic and technological penetration of the Russian ecosystem. And yet, Putin is willing to take that bargain because he believes that it is increasing his chances of prevailing in Ukraine and strengthening Russia against the West over the medium term. And the final point I would make here is that if Russia is able to win in Ukraine, and I use that term advisedly because Russia has already suffered catastrophic losses in Ukraine, but if it's able to force an unfavorable peace deal on the Ukrainian government, that's going to be a win not just for Russia. It's going to be a win for this larger autocratic entente, where all three of these other countries, Iran, North Korea, and China, have aided Russia in part because they're getting something for it, but also because they know that they stand to gain if the American international order, the liberal international order, whatever you want to call it, is weakened, and norms like the norm against the forcible conquest and annexation of territory are shattered, because they need those norms to be broken to accomplish their own revisionist projects. And so the stakes of the Ukraine war are not limited to Ukraine and Europe. It's much more of a global contest now.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because specifically on that point, a lot of people in the incoming Trump administration, people like Elbridge Colby, for example, would specifically say on that point that China, when making its calculations about Taiwan, doesn't really look at what Russia is doing in Ukraine, or that it's not going to base its decision on how the war in Ukraine will pan out. But based on what you're saying, you would probably disagree with that.
No, these are two separate arguments, right? And so there's a question about sort of what specifically tactically as a trigger would precipitate a Chinese move against Taiwan. And I don't think the outcome in Ukraine will be the dominant factor there. It will be a factor then. And so if what Xi Jinping sees is that the West supports Ukraine for a while but gets tired of it, and it has no appetite for actual military intervention in Ukraine and hesitates even to impose the most crippling economic sanctions on Russia, of course that's going to influence the reaction he anticipates from the United States and its friends if he attacks Taiwan. But it won't be the primary issue in driving that. But you can acknowledge that point and still say that, look, there is this international system that is built on a certain balance of power, and that balance of power underpins certain norms that are very important. The norm against the forcible annexation and conquest of territory being the most crucial of those. What China is trying to do in the Western Pacific is undermine that norm. It has laid claim to vast swaths of the South China Sea, among other things. And if you get a situation where that overall body of rules is weakened because you've had a case of very successful, very significant territorial aggression against Ukraine, of course that's going to benefit China. It doesn't necessarily mean that China is going to invade Taiwan tomorrow, but that world is a world that is much more conducive to what China is trying to achieve over the medium and long term.
Well, On that note, I think talking about the war, how much of a catalyst do you think that the Russian invasion and the war in Ukraine has been in all these processes that we're talking about? Also in the strengthening of the network of autocracies, because a lot of the things that are happening today, things like North Koreans fighting in Ukraine, would have been probably unimaginable a few years ago.
Yeah, I think Ukraine has sped up the course of history in this respect. All of these relationships go back well before February 2022. All of them are rooted in, I think, fairly deep convergences of interest in the sense that, all four of these countries don't like the prevailing international order because they think it constrains their ability to achieve their objectives. All four of them see the United States as the primary barrier to the expansion and the aggrandizement that they want to undertake. And all four are deeply authoritarian regimes that have to figure out a way of surviving and thriving in a world that has long been led by a democratic superpower. So there is a real strategic convergence there, and there is a real ideological convergence there. But typically the way this works is that it takes a crisis of some sort to accelerate the formation of relationships, to overcome barriers to collective action and things like that. And Ukraine has provided that crisis for the autocratic entente. And what became clear pretty early in the conflict was that Russia was going to pay a real price for invading Ukraine in its relationship with the West, in its economic relationship, and its diplomatic relationship. And the Russian elite, Putin namely, decided that the answer to this was to quadruple down on Russia's ties with other revisionist powers that might support its position, either explicitly or implicitly. And so a lot of the specific manifestations of these relationships have grown out of the Ukraine war, whether that's the really obvious stuff like deployments of North Korean troops to fight in this war, or the way that Russia has sort of opened up the gates a little bit in terms of technology transfer to China and some of its other partners. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that these relationships will go into reverse once the Ukraine war ends, if the Ukraine war ends anytime soon. Because I think what Russian officials, Iranian officials, North Korean officials, Chinese officials have learned is that there are real strategic benefits from this cooperation. And so they are going to be reluctant to let it go once the war ends. And I also think that the reality is that while, U.S.-China relations will wax and wane sort of tactically over the coming years, nobody around Xi Jinping really believes that there's a fundamental reset of Sino-American relations coming. And so if you expect that you're going to have high tensions and a degree of strategic confrontation with the United States in the years to come, then you've got to keep that relationship with Russia in particular in good shape. You got to continue to deepen it because you certainly can't afford to have hostility on two fronts at once. And if China does find itself in a deeper crisis or a war with the United States in the years to come, it's going to need, at the very least, sort of benign Russian neutrality, and hopefully, from Xi Jinping's perspective, active Russian support.
Do you think that from the U.S. foreign policy perspective, it makes sense to try to break this alliance apart and try to sort of at least weaken the bonds between the different actors, maybe put them against each other a little bit, sort of like during the Cold War it managed to do with Russia and China? Or do you think that by this point the bond is too strong and it just has to accept it as it is and just take all four as one package?
I think it's hard to fundamentally rupture these relationships because the bonds are relatively strong. And the Cold War comparison is attractive, but the critical thing to bear in mind is that by the time Henry Kissinger goes to China in 1971, the Soviet Union and China had already fought a war, right? They had fought a war on their shared border in 1969, and there's just no comparison between that and the state of, say, Sino-Russian relations today. And so you add that to the fact that, you know, these autocrats aren't stupid, right? They know Cold War history as well as we do. They know the United States is going to be looking for opportunities to split them, and so they're on guard against that, and it's going to be tough. I do think there might be one or two opportunities to start what I think will be a very long process of straining these relationships over time. So one way of doing that would be to put a lot of pressure on the weakest member of the autocratic quartet, which is Iran. And so Iran has had its air defenses shredded. It's had its proxy network set back dramatically over the past few months. And it seems likely that the Trump administration is going to come out of the gate with some pretty sharp economic pressure on Iran as well. The proximate goal of that is to come to grips with the Iranian nuclear program, which is an important thing to do. But one of the useful byproducts of this will be to demonstrate to the Iranians that, you know, their good friends, the Russians, are not going to be there for them if the U.S. and Israel ultimately decide to attack Iran's nuclear program, right? That there is a limit to these alliances in that respect. And one of the ways historically that these alliances have sometimes started to fray is when one party is disappointed with the support that the other party provides in a crisis. And so if you can create a mechanism for doing that's a good thing. The other thing that might happen is if the Trump administration decides to try to squeeze the Russian war economy by more aggressively sanctioning Chinese entities, and particularly Chinese banks that are facilitating the trade between China and Russia. That would come at a cost in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. You know, whether you think that is a good or a bad thing depends on your perspective on that relationship. But one of the effects would be to force Beijing to pay a higher price for its support of Russia, right? And again, over the near term, that could simply incentivize Russia and China to try to work a little bit harder to find, you know, alternatives to reliance on the dollar and that sort of thing. But as a general matter, I think that the more you can do to make Party A pay a higher price for supporting Party B, the more you can introduce at least the possibility of tension into those relationships over time.
I think moving to another big part of it, to the U.S. role and what should the U.S. policy be, I think that one thing that makes it a lot more complicated is that at a time when all of this is happening and you have all these global power dynamics, the U.S. now has an incoming administration which seems to have a very different idea of the role that the U.S. should play in the world to compared to what role traditionally the U.S. has played, even though it is quite confusing as to what exactly the new role should be, at least from the European perspective. So how do you expect the foreign policy of Trump administration and perhaps more broader changes that will stay even after this administration is gone to sort of fit into all of this? And how is that going to impact all these dynamics that are playing out? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.